We're going to look now at Acts, class. It is a sequel to Luke. We want to consider what kind of book it is. Why did Luke write Acts? How is it organized? How do we then grasp the message of Acts and then put it into our messages? We have 4 versions of the life and ministry of Jesus in the 4 Gospels, but we only have one account of the birth and the growth of the early church. So that makes Acts our one and only story of the spread of Christianity across the entire New Testament world. So it's very unique and very indispensable in our study of the New Testament. Okay, Acts has its own set of interpretive challenges. So we want to look at how Acts relates to the Gospel of Luke, and then also how does it promote belief about God, that is theology, and why did Luke write Acts? How did he organize it? And of course, most importantly, how do we grasp the message from Acts? The first thing we want to do is to compare the opening verses of Luke and also of Acts. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Now let's compare Luke's introduction to his gospel with that of his introduction to the Acts. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. So we see thematic and structural parallels. There's prayer, there's the work of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the gospel for all people, similar miracles, and a journey motif. There is definitely an overlap between Luke and Acts. If you look at Luke 24:49, it is fulfilled in Acts 1 and 2. And then we see the Holy Spirit is continuing the work of Jesus. What kind of book is Acts? Well, first of all, Acts is a story. Do you remember back in the Gospels when we talked about the Gospels being theological, or more specifically, Christological biographies? The evangelists had 2 central purposes in mind. They wanted to tell about Jesus, and they wanted to send a message to their readers by the way they arranged individual stories into a larger story. That is literary critical elements that we discussed. Now, there is a close connection between Luke and Acts, of course, and we're trying to indicate that. But the primary difference with Gospels is that they centered on one person, Jesus of Nazareth. But the story of Acts focuses on several key church leaders, mainly Peter and then Paul. Secondly, Acts is a theological history. Theological history. Where the gospel is theological biography, Acts is theological history. Luke is giving us an accurate, reliable history, but he has selected and arranged his material to advance the Christian faith. So as you seek the theological truths of Acts, Pay attention to the repeated themes and patterns that we are confronted with throughout the book. So why did Luke write Acts? Well, he writes to encourage and establish Theophilus and others like Theophilus more fully in their newfound faith. Why did Luke write Acts? Well, some have suggested that Acts is a kind of comprehensive discipleship manual that's designed to reinforce Christian faith for new believers. In fact, in your textbook, you'll see that the Holy Spirit empowers the church, Jewish and Gentile believers. They take the gospel of Jesus Christ into the world. After the Holy Spirit descends in Acts 2, the remainder of the work of Acts is recording that work of the Spirit throughout the church. In addition to the Holy Spirit, God's sovereignty in Acts is seen in the fulfillment of the Old Testament as God works out his plan in the book of Acts. Another reason Luke wrote Acts is to give us the community of the church. Prayer is a huge topic in the book. Practice of prayer is central to the life of the early church. The topic of suffering is also a key purpose in the book of Acts. We see the persecution of the early church beginning, and there are a number of references there in your textbook that will take you to those passages. A sixth purpose for Luke writing Acts is the fulfillment of the prophets from the Old Testament. In Acts, we discover that the true Israel is composed of Jews and Gentiles. 7, we see that Acts was written as we see the witness of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. How is Acts organized? Well, we read in Acts 1:8, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth." Thus, we see a geographical organization if we look at this verse. We can see that the gospel is preached throughout 1 through 7 in and around Jerusalem. Then, chapters 8 through 12, the gospel is preached in Judea and Samaria. And then, of course, the final half of the book, from 13 to 28, the gospel is preached out as far as Rome. There are two interpretive questions that we must grasp in order to understand the message of Acts. First of all, what is the central message of each episode? What is Luke telling his readers by the way that he puts the individual stories and speeches together to form the larger narrative? Thus, when answering the first question, remember to ask the standard diagnostic questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Then, when looking for the theological principles, look closely for connections and how the stories are positioned. Above all, pay attention to the repeated patterns and themes throughout the book. Is Acts normative for the contemporary church, or is it merely descriptive? Our authors believe that we would answer yes and yes to each of these questions. So the real question becomes, how do we determine what is normative and distinguish between what is merely descriptive? The way we do that is to look for what Luke intended to communicate to his readers. Look for positive and negative examples in the characters of the story. Next, we want to read the individual passages in light of the overall story of Acts and then the greater story of the entire New Testament. We can see a kind of concentric circles emanating from the message in Acts. For example, with the Holy Spirit. The Spirit comes upon the Jewish Christians at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. In Acts chapter 8, the Spirit comes on the Samaritan Christians, and then in Acts 10, the Spirit comes on the Gentile Christians. Look to other parts of Acts to clarify also what is normative. Look for repeated patterns and themes. Now, class, it's your turn to take the assignment 16-1 and look at one or two of these texts and see if you can take it through all 5 steps of the interpretive journey as we have illustrated in chapter 14. You do this by answering the 5 questions that represent the 5 steps of our hermeneutical model that we have taught you in this class. Now it's your turn.